Good day. Yesterday, I discussed at some length the extraordinarily interesting visit by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to Washington and the pressure that he came under whilst there to commit Germany to cancelling Nord Stream 2 in the event of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, an invasion which, to repeat, the Russians have never threatened, and Olaf Scholz's successful stonewall in response to the enormous pressure he came under whilst in Washington to make that commitment. I would add that since I made that video, I've also learned that Mr. Olaf Scholz was also invited to and had a sit-down meeting, apparently a lunch or dinner, with Senator Bob Menendez, who is, of course, the US senator who is currently putting a sanctions package together, which would include sanctions against Nord Stream 2 in the event of a Russian invasion. The fact that Scholz was required to meet people like Menendez gives some idea of the pressure he and Germany have been under with respect to Nord Stream 2. Anyway, that's Scholz in Washington. Let's now turn to that other big meeting, which has also just happened, which is Macron in Moscow. And here, the atmospherics were completely different. Macron and Putin were extraordinarily polite to each other. Each referred to the other, spoke to the other in using the other's first name. There was apparently a dinner with all kinds of expensive wines and foods served. This is not, by the way, one of those famed Kremlin banquets that used to be, provided by the Kremlin way back in Stalin's time. It was a much more small dinner involving Putin and his officials and Macron and his entourage, but nonetheless it was a sign of courtesy and friendship extended to Macron. So the atmosphere was completely different. None of the same pressure, none of the same tension that we saw over the course of Scholz's visit to Washington. But nonetheless, it was an extremely interesting meeting. And again, clarity, if one can use that expression, was provided by the press conference which the two leaders held after 6 hours of talks. So both of them must at this point have been pretty exhausted after a long day of talks, but they nonetheless came along and they had a press conference. And it is one of the most fascinating press conferences I have ever read a transcript of, because it's a case of one leader, Putin, talking with utter clarity, utter straightforwardness, setting his and Russia's positions on a host of international matters, and Macron, by contrast, engaging in elaborate and tortuous comments, making it fairly obvious to those who understand what his ultimate thinking is, but also obliged to give constant deference to the Western position, a Western position and an American position, which one senses that deep down he doesn't agree with. I have to say that Macron did it with great skill, and given that he did it after 6 hours of talks, it does show both a high degree of physical stamina and of mental energy that he was able to get through that press conference and never, so far as I can see, make a single gaffe or a single mistake. The contrast with another president who occupies the White House could not be starker. Anyway, let's get on to the press conference itself, and let's see what subsequently followed from it. Now, I said at the outset that Putin set out the Russian position with utter clarity, and he did it both in answer to questions and in his introductory comments. And he did it in a way, by the way, which shows that he, Putin, and the Russians are not giving an inch. They continue to make the demands, both in terms of security guarantees and in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, which they have always made, and they're not prepared to shift from those positions at all. And it was actually very interesting to read what Putin said, and of course this conveys clearly, as I said, the utter clarity and firmness of the Russian position. And we have comments like Putin from this. We continue to exchange views on the proposals regarding long-term, legally binding security guarantees, which Russia has made to the United States and NATO. I would like to remind everyone that these proposals include 3 points: NATO's non-expansion, non-deployment of offensive weapon systems near the Russian border, and the return of the bloc's European capabilities and infrastructure to the 1997 level when the NATO-Russia Founding Act was signed. Regrettably, the replies from the United States and NATO, which we received on January 26th, disregard these concerns of fundamental importance to us. Now, I've done a very long video, and I want to say immediately that whilst the NATO response, the NATO replies, not only disregard the Russian demands, but treat them with extraordinary disrespect, the US replies are actually more accommodating at this point than Putin wants us to think. And that's because Putin wants to make it completely clear to the Americans and to the world that Russia is not modifying or compromising on its position. If the Americans are making moves, very gradual, very incremental moves more so far in the form of language than of substance, well, that's not something he's going to reward the Americans for. He's going to stick to his position and until the Americans move a lot further than they have done up to now. Anyway, to continue. Moreover, our Western partners once again said that all states have a right to freely choose their security arrangements and to enter into any military blocs and alliances. We never question this principle. On the one hand, it is also obvious that these blocs and alliances have no obligation to admit any country that wishes to join them. The open door policy, which we have discussed with many of our partners, including with President Macron today, is very liberal. We believe that only the United States and possibly several other NATO members are benefiting from this interpretation of the fundamental principle of equal and indivisible security, which has been set down on many European documents and includes, as we all know, a pledge not to strengthen one's security at the expense of the security of other states. The reference to the open door policy, which I have mentioned, is questionable as well. I would like to repeat, I have said this on numerous occasions, including in this very room during a recent news conference following Prime Minister of Hungary Viktor Orbán's visit, that according to Article 10 of the 1949 Washington Treaty, the member states may, by unanimous agreement, invite any other European state in a position to contribute to European security to accede to that treaty. But this does not mean that the bloc is obligated to admit any country, as I have said as well. So he then goes on to say, I would like to point out that they continue to placate Russia with deliberations that NATO is a peaceful and purely defensive alliance. People in many countries, namely Iraq, Libya and Afghanistan, and by the way, later on in the press conference he also mentions Yugoslavia, have learnt the truth of this statement the hard way. And this is also true about the large-scale military operation against Belgrade, waged without a UN Security Council sanction, which is definitely not an operation that could be waged by a peaceful organisation. In addition, we cannot overlook the fact that the 2019 NATO military strategy openly describes Russia as the main security threat and an adversary. NATO has designated Russia an adversary. Moreover, while advancing its military infrastructure very close to our border, NATO and its member states believe they have a right to teach us where and how we can deploy our armed forces. They consider it acceptable to demand that we do not hold planned drills and exercises and present the movement of our troops on our own, I repeat, our own territory as a threat of a Russian invasion, in this case the invasion of Ukraine. They claim that the Baltic states and our other neighbours feel threatened as well. In any case, this presumption is being used to pursue an unfriendly policy towards Russia. As for the NATO member countries themselves, they continue to pump Ukraine with modern weapons to this accompaniment, allowing substantial financial resources to modernize the Ukrainian army and sending military specialists and instructors to Ukraine. So, he's not compromising on Russia's three core demands: an end to NATO expansion, a pullback of NATO forces from Eastern Europe, in effect a revision of the bloc's architecture, and the European security architecture, a return, in other words, to the position that had apparently been agreed at the time when the Soviet Union broke up, and which was the same position, as he says, existed at the time of the signing in 1997 of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. So he's not compromising on that at all. He's not compromising on Russia's right to deploy its armed forces anywhere that it wishes on Russian territory. He is also not compromising on the issue of NATO's open door. As he quite rightly says, this principle of NATO's open door does not in fact exist. The Article 10 of the Washington Treaty of 1949 does not refer to any sort of open door. It is the alliance that takes the initiative to invite a member state to join it, if doing so would enhance the security of the North Atlantic area. There is no provision in Article 10 of the Washington Treaty that says that a country has a right to join NATO, a right to apply to NATO for membership, or a right to be granted membership by NATO. So this open door policy is a fiction. It has no reality. And of course, Putin then goes on to say that insisting upon this non-existent, fictitious principle of this open door policy, one which has no basis in the Washington Treaty, Article 10 of the Washington Treaty, directly contradicts the various provisions in the various international agreements that security is indivisible and that no country should enhance its security at the expense of the other. By the way, on the last point, I've recently been reading some articles in the Western media, at least in the British media, trying to address this issue of indivisible security which the Russians are bringing, trying to find some kind of response to it. And it is striking to see that they have not been able to do so. I've read articles about this in The Guardian, The Times of London, and in the Financial Times. And one, and indeed also in the BBC. And in each and every one of them, there's been what you expect to be some build-up saying that the Russian position is clearly wrong, and in the end they have to pull back and simply say, well, this is all the topic of interpretation. It's not a topic of interpretation. It is in fact entirely clear. All one has to do is read the relevant documents, the documents of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and one can see that for oneself. And of course, it is also the impression that the Russians were given when those documents, those declarations, the 1999 Istanbul Declaration, the 2010 Astana Declaration, and all the others were signed. So there we go. So on the key issue of NATO enlargement, of the dismantling of NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe, not a sign of any kind of shift from Putin at all. And then, of course, he turns to the situation in Ukraine, which is, of course, the one that we are hearing so much about, the one that the United States and some of the Western powers, notably Britain, want to talk about, rather than talk about the Russian demand for legally binding security guarantees and Russia's discussions about NATO. And here again, we see no shift from Putin on Russia's position. We have made a point of drawing Mr. President, he means Macron's, attention to the reluctance of the current Kiev authorities to meet their commitments under the Minsk package of measures and the Normandy format agreements, including those reached at the summits in Paris and Berlin. It is clear to everyone that the current authorities in Kiev have set a course for dismantling the Minsk Accords. There are no shifts on such fundamental issues as constitutional reform, amnesty, local elections, and the legal aspects of a special status for Donbass. The well-known Steinmeier formula, well known to specialists at any rate, when we have approved certain amendments to the Minsk Accords and made definite concessions, is yet to be included in Ukrainian legislation. But even these items presented by the current president of the Federal Republic of Germany, at that time he was the German foreign minister, are not being implemented. Kiev is still disregarding all opportunities for a peaceful restoration of the country's territorial integrity via direct dialogue with Donetsk and Lugansk. I also directed Mr. President, again means Macron's, attention to the widespread and systematic violations of human rights in Ukraine. Dissenting media are closed in the country and political opponents are exposed to reprisals. By the way, this is the point where he talked about Russia offering asylum to Poroshenko. The Financial Times said this was a joke. That was not my impression. I think that Putin was making a serious point. He obviously doesn't mean or expect Poroshenko to apply for asylum in Russia. He was simply making the point that it is Ukraine that is engaging in political repression, not Russia at this time. And then he went on to say that he expects the Minsk agreements to be implemented in full. And further down, in response to a question, he made it clear that even though Ukraine clearly doesn't like the Minsk agreements, the fact is that it has to implement them, whether it likes it or not, if there is to be peace in Ukraine. And he made a comment here drawn from Russian folklore, a kind of comment that Russian mothers tell their children when they give them cough mixture, which, by the way, I've seen some people misrepresent in an incredibly vulgar fashion in parts of the Western media. It is, in fact, a perfectly standard Russian turn of phrase. So that's Putin. No concession on his part. He's not prepared to shift on any position of substance, whether in relation to Russia's core demands, the ones that were set out in those written responses to the Americans and NATO, which we've been discussing at such length in previous programs, but also and in addition on the need for full implementation of the Minsk agreement by Ukraine in order to achieve a final solution to the problem, the conflict, the internal conflict in Ukraine. So it could not be simpler, could not be clearer, and there is no ambiguity or uncertainty or doubt about Putin's position. But it's remarkable now to see the contrast with the way in which Macron spoke. And again, I'm going to focus on his introductory comments, which essentially set out everything that Macron said, though he did make some rather interesting observations over the course of the press conference in replies to questions. And as I said, it is remarkable to see how complicated Macron's words are by comparison with the simplicity of Putin's. And again, just to reiterate, I'm impressed at Macron's skill after 6 hours of negotiation to pull it off. Anyway, this is Macron's words at the press conference, and I'm going to read out the whole introductory comments in full just to give the flavour of them, and I will touch on one or two of the things he said over the course of the press conference in response to questions. So, to begin, thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, Vladimir. It's Vladimir and Emmanuel, apparently right through the entire meeting. Mr. President, you have reminded us of Russia's views on the situation regarding the North Atlantic Alliance, Russia's security interests, and the Ukrainian issue. You have touched upon the most diverse issues. Indeed, we're now marking the 30th anniversary of establishing diplomatic relations of this bilateral agreement you mentioned. I will not discuss relations between our two countries in greater detail at present, because we now realise that the situation is serious and all of us should find a way, a peaceful way, a path towards stability in Europe. Now, those last words, path towards stability in Europe, is already going to ring alarm bells in some NATO capitals. But to continue, we still have the opportunity and the time to do this. The historical and strategic dialogue that we have developed over the past years can help accomplish this. We have decided to meet in precisely this context in Moscow today. So it's a substantive discussion about achieving stability in Europe being undertaken by Russia and France. As I said already, a situation, as I said, which is going to cause alarm bells in some NATO capitals and in NATO headquarters to ring. We held very substantial to-the-point talks. We focused on current areas of tension and on options for de-escalation to facilitate stability and security on our continent. Mr. President, you have reminded us of Russia's views on the situation regarding the North Atlantic Alliance, Russia's security interests, and the security Ukrainian issue. You have touched upon the most diverse issues. We can see that you have a very strong position, which does not always coincide with the European and Western position. It is necessary to underscore this. We have different views, and we need to understand and accept this. We discussed this in great detail. I believe in Europe and European unity, and this is a fundamental matter. Notice the extremely respectful way in which Macron is addressing Putin. He says, you've explained your position. It's a very strong position. We don't always agree, but we need to discuss this in the interests of Europe. We need to discuss our differences with each other. And then he goes on to come to perhaps more substantive points. It is true that NATO's open door policy, which is very important, it is an existential matter, was adopted regarding, say, Sweden and Finland. It would be very difficult to tell them that NATO plans to change its stand. Actually, it'd be very easy, but never mind. However, we need to consider the issues you have mentioned. The series of misunderstandings and traumatic events that took place over the past 30 years, and the need to create new security and stability mechanisms in the region. At the same time, I do not think that the creation of these new mechanisms implies a partial revision of the treaties signed over the past 30 years and our fundamental principles, or a restriction of the rights of some European countries that are not parties to the existing treaties. This is an extremely important point. Well, it's a very complicated point, because he says, well, we can't change on NATO's open door position because that would upset the Swedes and the Finns. But notice that he doesn't say anything about the Ukrainians. And it is, of course, Ukraine that is the key point of issue. But then he says that there have been a series of misunderstandings and traumatic events that took place over the past 30 years. In other words, since the end of the Cold War. He's not telling us what these misunderstandings and traumatic events were, but of course Putin has spelled them out. He's talked about the wars in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia. He's talked about the promises which were given to the Russians, to the Soviets at the time when the Soviet Union broke up, that there would be no eastward NATO expansion, that NATO would not expand an inch east. He refers to the commitments that were made or appeared to have been made at the time of the signing of the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997. And of course he refers to the different interpretations of the 1999 Istanbul and Astana treaties, the way in which the NATO in 2009 disregarded Russia's concerns at the in 2008 disregarded Russia's concerns, and at the Bucharest summit invited Georgia and Ukraine one day to join NATO, even though it refused them NATO membership action plans. He's also obviously referring to the 2008 Russia-Georgia war, which followed the Georgian attack on South Ossetia. And he's referring also to the various color revolutions that have taken place in various former Soviet republics, including, of course, in Ukraine itself in 2014. Doesn't want to spell these out because, of course, doing so would annoy the Americans and the British and the Poles and all sorts of other people. But clearly, this is what he's referring to. And he talks about the need to create new mechanisms, whilst at the same time saying that this does not require revision of existing treaties. Well, that might sound like saying, well, we're going to keep the existing treaties as they are. But of course, Macron knows perfectly well that the Russians aren't asking for any change to the existing treaties. They're not saying, for example, that countries like Bulgaria, which joined NATO after 1997, should be forced to leave NATO. So they're not actually saying that the treaties need to be amended or revised. What the Russians are actually saying is that the treaties need to be implemented, only implemented according to Moscow's interpretation. And Macron actually by these words, appears to hint that he actually agrees with the Russians about this. He talks about new security and stability mechanisms which would be consistent with the existing treaties, which is essentially the same thing as the Russians are saying. Maybe he's not prepared to go all the way that the Russians are. Maybe he's not prepared to agree to the kind of treaties that the Russians have proposed in draft, but he's coming very, very close to saying that the Russians deserve to get what they are asking for, and that this is, in fact, consistent with the existing treaties and will secure stability in Europe. And then he goes on to say, having said all this, we nevertheless tried to find points where our positions coincided so as to make headway on them in the near future. Firstly, it is necessary to work very quickly to avoid any escalation. Tensions continue to rise today, and this exacerbates the risk of destabilization. This is not in anyone's interests. So he wants destabilization, but note he's not saying here that the Russians need to take any steps to achieve that de-escalation. And who then is supposed to take the steps to achieve that de-escalation? Well, as we're going to discover shortly, it is in fact the Ukrainians. But anyway, to press on. Neither Russia nor the Europeans want chaos and instability now that people on the continent have sustained such heavy economic and social losses from the pandemic and want recovery and tranquility. That is why we need to come to an agreement on practical stabilization and de-escalation measures. So, again, what that says is, well, sanctions might be tough for the Russians, and they'll be extremely tough for us as well. So let's do everything we possibly can to avoid getting into that position. We have discussed this together. This should be reaffirmed within the next few days or weeks. The result will depend on the talks and consultations with the United States, NATO and the Europeans, as well as the outcome of my meeting with President Zelensky tomorrow. I would like to note that President Putin said that he's ready to follow this logic and help maintain the balance in these initiatives, including the issue of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Well, what does that actually mean? President Putin said he's ready to follow the logic and help maintain the balance in these initiatives. Well, I presume what it means is that the Russians, Putin, have said to Macron, they've no doubt reassured him in private, yes, we have no intention of invading Ukraine. They've been saying that in public. They're no doubt very happy to say that to Macron in private too. But I suspect they gave Macron rather more substantive reassurances than just that. There's rumours, which the Russians are not confirming, that Putin told Macron, for example, that the Russian troops, which are currently in Belarus, conducting exercises there, will return to their permanent bases in Russia once those exercises are over, and things of that kind. So I'm sure there've been more substantive reassurances given. And of course, underpinning all of this is the fact that Putin obviously told Macron that he supports Macron's initiatives. To sum up, the next few days will be decisive and obviously require intense discussions that we will continue together. We shall be very clear that our conversation is that reliable de-escalation calls for making headways. Very clear from our conversations is that reliable de-escalation calls for making headway on fundamental matters. Complicated sentence, not quite sure what it means. We had a lengthy discussion on these matters. We must jointly show the will to work on security guarantees and build a new security and stability order in Europe. It must be based on the foundation we have created together as sovereign states. Some kind of negotiation on Russia's security guarantees is therefore essential, and work on it must start now. That's what that sentence says, although those two sentences say. This is the principle of continuity of states. I'm referring to Russia, France, and other states that are also parties to these treaties. Therefore, it is the fundamental principle of European security. We have approved them by signing the Paris Charter and the subsequent ODYSEE declarations. That means the 1999 Istanbul Declaration and the 2010 Astana Declaration. He recognizes their validity, doesn't mention them by name, because again that might cause some ructions with the Americans, but clearly he agrees with the Russian interpretations of them. And then he goes on to say, I am referring to the principle of the territorial integrity of states, the threat to use or use of force, inviolability of frontiers, non-interference in internal affairs, as well as violations of international law, human rights and basic freedoms. So he's qualifying it. He says, yeah, actually, I do agree with you on the 1999 Istanbul and 2010 Astana declarations. But when he goes on to gloss it, he is careful to leave out the point about indivisible security, which the Russians are harping on. He clearly agrees with the Russians about this, but he understands that if he were to say it outright, there would be great anger in London and Washington, not to mention Warsaw and Kiev. And then we get further things. Whatever the historical interpretations of various crises and incidents may be, to maintain the security of our continent, as we have said many times, we must not repeat the past mistakes. So, there may be different interpretations, but there have been mistakes made. Mistakes by whom exactly? He's not saying it's the Russians, so who has made those mistakes? We talked for several hours today, but we also talked about this in the past, several years ago. I understand that opinions can differ and that there can be misunderstandings and even traumatic elements. Traumatic is a very strong word. What is he referring to? The 2014 coup in Kiev, the crisis in Yugoslavia, the bombing of Belgrade in 1999, the wars against Libya and Afghanistan and Iraq. What exactly is he referring to here? I know that many EU countries did not have the same experience in the 20th century as France did. We must not forget this experience, which has not faded away over the past 30 years. That's a deference to the former communist states of the Warsaw Pact, the states upon which the Soviet Union imposed its political and economic system during the Cold War, much to their resentment. And clearly they have, as Macron concedes, legitimate feelings and grievances about that. And we mustn't forget that. But then he goes on to say, however, we cannot accept the collective risk of another confrontation between spheres of influence in Europe and another period of instability and unrest. This is creating new grievances and new threats. Starting a conflict is easy, but ending it and building a lasting peace is difficult. This is an extraordinarily interesting sentence, because he says, look, Eastern European states have past experiences. They have legitimate feelings and legitimate grievances based on those past experiences. France hasn't shared those experiences, but it recognizes the fact. But these feelings and grievances that the East European states unquestionably do have cannot be the basis of policy if that calls into question the peace of Europe, because doing so simply substitutes one sphere of influence, the Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe, with another, the North Atlantic sphere. It's interesting that he's used that expression, spheres of influence, and it creates new grievances and new threats in place of the old ones. And then he goes on to say, I do not believe that we must choose between new rules and the absence of rules. This is optimism based on will, as I see it. So again, essentially, we don't need to revise anything. The Russians aren't actually asking us to revise any treaties. They want everything to be implemented, and basically we agree with them. We don't want to say that outright, but that's our view, that's our feeling. And then he goes on to say, Russia is committed to the principle of sovereignty and related rights. So Russians actually accept the principle of sovereignty and related rights. I am convinced that we will be able to build security and stability in Europe, confirming what we have already achieved within the ODYSEE framework. So the basis upon which all this is to be done is not NATO, it is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is of course the entity created ultimately in that line of treaties going all the way back to the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, through the Paris Charter of 1990, the Istanbul Declaration of 1999, and the 2010 Astana Declaration. And it's all going to be based on sovereignty and related rights, and Russia accepts them, and there's no need to revise the treaties. We should also come up with new solutions that should probably be more innovative as regards our ability to ensure specific security guarantees. Again, Russia talks about security guarantees. France is willing to talk about security guarantees, and they're prepared to look for innovative solutions. We raised this issue directly during our conversation, respecting the interests of all our European brothers and ensuring their stability and security, as well as with due regard to the security guarantees proposed by Russia, our neighbour and friend. Russia has proposed security guarantees. We need to talk about security guarantees, and Russia is entitled to security guarantees, and it's our neighbour, but it's also our friend. Well, you won't find many people in London or Washington or Brussels, never mind Warsaw, to actually call Russia a friend at this time. But here we see Macron actually doing that. And then he talks about various other issues. He talks about Belarus. We'll skip all of that. And then then he goes on to say, I'm indeed concerned about these matters because they're increasing destabilization. We should work together on practical security guarantees for the EU member states and for the regional countries, namely Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, and Russia. This is the goal we must pursue. So a security dialogue between the EU and the Russians for practical security guarantees, also for regional countries which are not members of the EU, including Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, and Russia. In effect, an admission that alongside Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and Belarus will not join the European Union. They are entitled to security guarantees. They will get those security guarantees. The security guarantees are not going to be provided by NATO. The EU will have a role. France will have a role. Russia will have a role. The United States will have a role. NATO has only a marginal role. And of course, It will be security guarantees to secure the positions of Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, and Russia, which will not be members of the EU. I must say there is common ground between the positions of France and Russia. You were the ones to start consultations with NATO and the United States, and now we will have to have continued detailed talks with all partners in the next few weeks with the express purpose of creating these new peace and security guarantees. Russia has long asked for certain security guarantees, such as restrictions on military deployment and presence of conventional weapons, the transparency of missile defense, and on intermediate and shorter range missiles. These Russian proposals correspond to the requirements of European states, the EU states. So Russia's demands for legally binding security guarantees, for restrictions on military deployment, for restrictions on the presence of conventional weapons, for restrictions for transparency about missile defense, for restrictions on intermediate and shorter range missiles. These Russian proposals correspond with the interests, requirements of European states and of the EU. I am sure that a response can only be collective. And then he says, we are Europeans, but we are also allies of the United States. We have already demonstrated that we can work together. And then, of course, he talks, so he's essentially telling the Russians, look, on everything that you're saying, on the indivisibility of security, on NATO's eastward expansion, we agree with you. On your quest for legally binding security guarantees, we agree with you. About all the specific points you're asking for, about military deployments, infrastructure, missile deployments, all the rest, we agree with you too. We accept that Georgia and Ukraine will not be joining the EU. We also are looking for some way beyond NATO. Georgia and Ukraine certainly are not going to join NATO, and we basically agree with you about NATO enlargement. But we have to be incredibly difficult how we say this, because, well, we are allies of the United States, and we have to work with them. Difficult, there that sometimes is, and we are going to work, however, towards achieving that goal. And then, of course, he talks about the Ukrainian conflict. The third element on which we have managed to find converging positions, which President Putin has mentioned is his statement, is the Ukrainian conflict. I'm going to Kiev tomorrow to meet with President Zelensky. Of course, we are doing this jointly with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, with whom we coordinated our positions several days ago. I see him tomorrow afternoon in Berlin. We continue working within the framework of the Normandy format to ensure full compliance with the Minsk agreements and to achieve a complete settlement of the conflict in Donbass. The key words here are full compliance with the Minsk agreements. In other words, compliance with the Minsk agreements political provisions, the ones that the Ukrainians are resisting, in order to achieve a complete settlement of the conflict in Donbass. And then he discusses what's going to happen. Serious agreements regarding the ceasefire regime were reached during the recent advisors' meeting of the Normandy format countries, and now we must move forward in terms of practical steps to ensure a clear and full implementation of these agreements. He means the ceasefire agreements. We have made progress on several technical issues during the talks, and then he speaks very warmly about Zelensky, about the fact that Zelensky is making specific agreements on the implementation of the ceasefire. And then now he comes to perhaps an even more interesting point about Zelensky. In particular, President Zelensky promised to withdraw the legislation that did not conform to the Minsk agreements, and President Putin mentioned this. So this is the legislation that has been going through the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, in which Ukraine has been looking to impose its own political structure on a reintegrated Donbass. The Russians have been angrily complaining that this is unacceptable, that this legislation contradicts the Minsk agreement, which requires the political structures of the Donbass to be negotiated with the leaders of the Donbass, the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And Macron says that Zelensky has agreed to withdraw this legislation. The legislation was withdrawn at President Zelensky's initiative. I have also received detailed explanations from President Putin regarding the rumors about some draft laws also being proposed in Russia. These are draft laws about recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk, of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And Putin reassured Macron, he reassured us that this would not happen if they were not in line with the Minsk agreements. Now that the situation has become clear, we must continue working with this vein. This is important for peace and stability in Europe because this conflict is at the center of the tension that we are experiencing today. And of course, Russia and the European Union need to settle this conflict so that we can move forward in our relations. So, Ukrainian conflict must be settled. That is the de-escalation measures that Macron is talking about, and it must be done, as Putin says, on the basis of the full implementation of the Minsk agreement. That's an extraordinary set of comments by Macron. He's extremely careful, as I said, over the course of this very complicated press conference, to be extremely careful not to say things too clearly, so as not to create uproar in Washington, Brussels, London, Warsaw and Kiev. And he managed it, and I have to say that he succeeded in doing it after 6 hours. Does, as I said, show a very high degree of mental energy, if it does nothing else. And I have to say, I mean, I'm not always a fan of Macron, that's putting it mildly, but I am impressed. I'm impressed that after so many hours, he was able to do it, and he was able to carry it off with so much skill. And of course, if you go through his various the various questions that he's been put to the telephone, to put to him in the press conference, he talks at length about various issues, and again, over the course of it, he makes it absolutely clear that it's the Minsk agreement that is the way forward. There can only be a political solution. This is Macron again, in answer to a question, a political solution to the Ukrainian issue, and the Minsk agreements are the only foundation for it. The Normandy format is the right format. Let me repeat that Ukraine, Russia, France and Germany sit at the table in this format. These agreements provide for initiatives and progress. They should move forward in the next few days and weeks. Now the process is back on track. Some very sensitive issues on constitutional reform, on elections are now under discussion and will be developed in the near future. So, the political provisions of the Minsk agreement must be implemented. That includes constitutional reform, laws on elections, all the things that are set out in the Minsk agreement, which up to now the Ukrainians have been refusing to do. And note that Macron is extremely careful to emphasize that everything he is doing in coordination with Chancellor Scholz of Germany. And so here we go. And sure enough, Macron went to Ukraine and he told the Ukrainians, we now learn, I'm quoting TASS, but these are his words, Macron urged Ukraine to comply with the Minsk agreements that are the sole foundation for settling the crisis in Ukraine. And he said this following his meeting with Zelensky. The Minsk Accords are the only way that will allow us to establish peace, the only way that will help find a long-term political solution. And the Russians are taking note of all of this. And there's been an article in the Russian newspaper Izvestia in which we read, and this must be based on Russian-French discussions, Russia does not intend to go to war with Ukraine. This is the fundamental signal that French President Macron transmitted from Moscow to Kiev. And then it goes on to say that he wants to get the Ukrainians to comply with the Minsk agreement. And Macron now has this mission. He's going to try to persuade the Ukrainians to get Minsk implemented along the lines that have been said and set out in February 2015. And he's all but confirmed that Ukraine and Georgia too are joining neither NATO nor the EU, because having them join NATO or the EU would be destabilizing and would threaten the peace of Europe. Well, major obstacles in the way. The very fact that Macron has to use all this incredibly complicated language shows how difficult all this is. And we've already seen some angry responses from Ukraine. There was an interesting article in the Daily Telegraph. It reads, Ukraine under pressure to bow to Russian demands after meeting with Emmanuel Macron. The French president signaled the West would back Russian demands for Ukraine to change its constitution to avert an invasion. And we go on to read, Ukraine was on Tuesday under pressure to bow to Russian demands to change its constitution after Macron signaled the West would back the move as a path to avert war. And we read further down in the article about how unhappy the Ukrainians would be about this. Ukrainian officials say privately that those provisions would fatally undermine the country's sovereignty by granting the Kremlin a lever to control both foreign and domestic policy, and so unpopular with the public they would trigger the collapse of any government that tried to implement them. But speaking in Kiev alongside Mr. Zelensky on Tuesday, Mr. Macron called the agreement the only path to a sustainable peace. I discussed these questions with President Putin yesterday, and he confirmed his intention to continue implementation of the Minsk agreement. I also heard today from you that you are also ready to fulfill these agreements, he added to Mr. Zelensky. So there we go. An attempt by the French to get Minsk back on track. All of this in a very complicated political situation. The British are frankly hostile. They're very unhappy about Minsk, even though they voted for it in the Security Council. The United States, of course, has its own views, and as we've discussed in previous programs, there are divisions about this matter within the administration, with some taking an extremely hard anti-Russian line, others less sure. We will see what happens over the next few days. But Macron is at least trying, and there is something to be said for that. Well, I'm almost up to an hour now of speaking. As I said, this is a complicated, intricate press conference. It gives us an idea of where all this is heading. Thank you for joining me again today. Join me soon on the Duran and on Locals. Buy things from our shop. Join us on Rumble, and if you see Rumble, you can see us on Rumble. You can tick the maroon button, and that will take you straight to our Locals page. And of course, check your subscription to this. Please check your subscription to this channel, and tick the like button to this video if you've liked this video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.